Set in the Chicago-inspired Lakeshore City, stylized with cel shading, and begun with the betrayal of your best friend Jasmine, who took the car you worked on for months and ruined your adoptive father Rydell, Need for Speed Unbound is a game about working up through 4 weeks of 3 qualifiers to win the biggest street race in Lakeshore and take your car back from Yaz. It's fun, by which I mean it's mostly made of driving, and the driving is fun. One of Unbound's best ideas is Burst Nitrous. It's a second, yellow gauge that obeys different rules and thus encourages different responses from the first. For one, it's a burst. That will soon become important. For another, it's staggered. There are 3 bars and a bar must be filled completely to use it, which encourages you to get that one more near miss or to drag out your drafts and drifts just a little longer. Burst Nitrous is also temporary. If you don't use it when you have it, it will quickly disappear, and what that does is encourage you to keep up the combo or to take a risk. You can't always wait for the ideal place with Burst Nitrous. If you're in a precarious situation, there's a risk reward. Do I shoot ahead but risk losing control, or do I play it safe? It's effective and thrilling, and thrill is why you're playing a game like this. Sense of speed has undergone a considerable improvement for Unbound. The newfound richness and granularity of detail in the world itself better quantifies the speed at which you're passing it. Motion blur is effective and aggressive, streaks appear at the highest speeds, wind whips in tunnels, but it's the ever-controversial anime visual effects that truly make the difference here. Rather than something as meaningless as a static effect, Unbound's effects only exist when they can emphasize the coolness of a moment or the motion of the car. Smoke bellows when rubber burns, wings flash in mid-air, light begins to trail when you cross 100 miles per hour, but their most enthusiastic response is to Burst Nitrous. Energy sparks around the body when it's charged, before an explosion of color hurls you into a short-lived overdrive. You're not even going that much faster with the full 3-bar charge, but you certainly feel like you are. Unbound's visual effects intrude on nothing, and succeed completely in their attempt to make what Need for Speed is good at better: the thrill and excitement of driving dangerously. As it was in Heat, cars handle well enough at any speed. They've got the weight, they're responsive, and they more or less react to their environments convincingly. The G-forces and grip turns are clearly felt, and drifting, for the average player's purposes, feels smooth enough. But it's the high speeds that keep you coming back. It's here, in the hundreds, that you're placed at the edge of control, where your car remains stable, but there's the sense, the fear, that you're one mistake away from ending up in a Netflix disaster documentary, or losing a position. It's where a carefully balanced density of oncoming traffic keeps you mechanically engaged, constantly, no matter how straight or how long the road, and tense in equal measure. This is the thrill that only Need for Speed can provide in the modern racing scene. It's the best thing about Unbound, and it's also, basically, unfair. Traffic isn't fair, it's unpredictable, you can't avoid it every time, and even when you could, the fact that you had to whilst another racer did not, is a fundamental inequality. You will be wrecked in this game, and it will be bullshit, and that won't be a rare occurrence. This is the price we pay for the street racing thrill. It's a problem fundamental to these games, and for some, it will continue to be too much to tolerate. For most, it's a price worth paying. Well, usually. We'll get to that. For now, I want to talk about the most important effect of Burst Nitrous, its effect on balance. For a very long time, grip turns in Need for Speed have not been competitively viable. But you didn't need to be a hardcore player to know that. Grip turning is harder than drift. You need to employ the brakes, judge distances, and turn in at the right time. Why would the casual player bother when they're entirely comfortable making effective drifts for a fraction of the effort? Unbound changed things by rewarding grip turns with Burst Nitrous. A lot of Burst Nitrous, and a lot more than drift. A decent grip turn will net you a full charge, and the moment I recognized that, I began experimenting with a form of handling that had been largely ignored, unknowingly, for so many entries before, and I loved it. It's nice to have a new form of challenge when cornering in Need for Speed. So is the variation. Now playstyle would change from car to car, and even from corner to corner if your car could reasonably handle both. If it can do both, then there's even a touch of depth in the choice. Which is best for this turn, grip or drift? But if there's anything I love about it, it's how it feels. Like pulling back a bowstring, then letting it fly. So, the going fast is good and the turning is good. That's really good. But there's more. This is a game that gets the racing right. Track splits are a welcome return, bringing a sense of dynamism and life to the race, and bringing, in moments, an interesting decision too. On the docks, for instance, if I was feeling confident enough to execute an extended grip turn, I would choose the higher path, and the full tank of Burst Nitrous would outcompete the easier straight below. You can also customize your car to reward more Burst Nitrous for specific behaviors, which may then influence what splits you pick. The one with more corners, the one with a jump, or the one where other racers are, if you've got the drafting upgrade. upgrade. Race rewards are another win. In a creative middle ground between Horizon 4's placement doesn't matter and Horizon 5's only first place matters, you will lose money in Unbound for placing poorly, but good positions are all rewarded well. There is incentive for strong performance, and yet there is comfort with not getting the ideal result, and so the game keeps moving, not getting bogged down in repetitive perfectionism. But what I found particularly impressive was that I always believed that the ideal result was attainable. The chaos of Lakeshore's streets is just as much a danger for your enemies as it is for you, and the driving AI is just as capable of making mistakes. I was convinced that I could outdrive a power differential between me and a better car ahead, and I believed that I could recover some, if not most, if not all of the positions I lost from one of my own failures, and my faith was often rewarded. Things don't feel set in stone in Unbound in the way they do in Horizon. The sense of competition never dies, and that's big. Adding to this is the successful implementation of car combat. The driving model handles fishtailing and pushing enemies into obstacles intuitively, but not whilst making it easy. So, if a rival is pissing you off or you consider them a threat, then, for a cost in speed, and a risk of screwing yourself, you can take them out. Though not the most important, perhaps the most interesting success of Unbound's enemies is that they are fleshed out in the literal sense. They have bodies, faces, and personalities to match their names, which is great, because that makes it much easier to hate them. Other people. Am I right, fellas? When an irritating little shitweed passes you, that stings in a way a mere name would not, and Criterion do their best to play it up. They'll taunt you, they'll threaten you, they'll hit you, and then comment on hitting you. They're cocky, and that makes you want to take risks to relieve them of their cock. So it's a good thing that contact is something the physics handles well. Humanity introduces a never-before-seen layer of narrative stakes into races. By making things personal, it makes things tenser, and in a simpler but critical way, it fulfills the juvenile competitive fantasy of street racing. You're supposed to butt heads. Criterion does not make enough of an effort to stop the same lines repeating in a short space of time. Neither are there enough lines in total for the fastest rivals you're likely to interact with most often, like Lyric and Medusa. And it's disappointing a rival can open their heart or explicitly offer friendship in their side mission, but return to status quo dialogue in the races. The impression of humanity does fade with time, but never enough to put more than a dent in their success. Compounding on what works is the side bet system, which allows you to challenge specific racers as an aside to the race payout. The better their car is than your car, the more money you stand to gain. And it is a glorious feeling, not only to take the money of someone you dislike, but also to flex on the entire crew by challenging the top dog and winning. I hate all of these bastards, and I might need to seek psychiatric help, but it's a testament to the success of Unbound's rivals that I realize that. When it's dodgy bastards trying to take my money online, however, it's not therapy I need, it's something far simpler, far cheaper, and far less time-consuming. NordVPN. Imagine being stuck on non-US Netflix. Couldn't be me, couldn't be my French brethren either, who have to put up with the worst selection of shows ever created because we simply hoodwink our internet into letting us watch HBO Max, smug Brits bake sponge cakes on BBC iPlayer, or the kind of things that you might want to hide from your ISP. Another cool thing you can do with NordVPN is not get hacked. Your diverted IP address will help you avoid DDoS attacks, and the inbuilt threat protection software will forewarn you of malware, ransomware, dodgy advertisements, or phishing attacks, which is where a scammer pretends to be Amazon or a hot single in your area, asks for your sensitive information, and does bad things with it. Now, you can get an exclusive deal at nordvpn.com/whitelightVPN, and to commemorate the company's 11th birthday, there's a limited time mystery gift included in the package. So, the racing in Unbound is fast, thrilling, and continuously engaging. It's flawed, but it's better than Heat, and I'd take it in a heartbeat over the competition. So now it's time to talk about what's wrong with it. Let's start with the crash physics. The punishment for crashing in Unbound is light. You're respawned quickly, you're respawned at speed, and you're respawned a fair distance ahead of the crash site. Crash detection is also very sensitive in Unbound. It doesn't need to be that big a knock to end up on your roof. But if the punishment is light, why does it have to be sensitive? In the case of a glancing blow or a side-on collision with the environment, why not simply punish my health bar and my speed, and avoid the crash altogether? Crash cams arrest control for several seconds and puncture the momentum of the race. It's a frustrating interruption when it feels needless, and it often does. But much worse is the frustration of certain crashes whose validity you will be right to question, because crash detection is simply unfinished. At first, the problem seems to be far too much importance placed on the speed of the contact, and far too little placed on angle. It is not what you would expect that trading paint is an instant death, but a head-on collision barely scratches recharges my health bar, even though it's slower. But then something stranger happens. Another head-on collision does instantly kill me, and I survive a significantly faster sideways impact unharmed. It adds significantly to the confusion that the car is forced to flip for the crash cam even if it makes no physical sense. You'll usually die to the big crashes and survive the smaller ones, just as you'd expect. It's the too many times that you're killed by something that prior evidence suggests you shouldn't have been that frustrate me, especially so in a game that is already on thin ice when it comes to my tolerance for bullshit, especially so in a game that limits your restarts. This is part of the design philosophy to emphasize consequence, and it is another way to discourage the player from endlessly repeating the same event with a first or nothing mindset at the cost of their own enjoyment. It's the fear of running out of restarts that successfully meets these ends. What happens if you do run out of restarts, however, can fuck off, because the kind of thing that would make you want to restart might not be your fault, and that could cost you 30 minutes of your life. In these rare but unforgettable flares of frustration, Unbound goes far beyond tolerating. Here's a story. In the weekend qualifiers, you have to come first. If you run out of restarts, the game forces you to reset from Friday morning, completely erasing your progress that day and night. You've lost over an hour of effort and progress. Would you like to see the reasons that happened to me? This is not the price we pay for the street racing thrill. This achieves nothing. Well, nothing but a psychotic break. Limited restarts were the wrong move. If the race's rewards began to diminish, starting from your second restart, the coronaries might have been avoided, and repetition still discouraged. Moving on to Burst Nitrous. There is one more thing to say about this mechanic, and that's that it makes the game much easier. Not just because you now have 2 nitrous bars, but because Burst Nitrous makes mistakes cost less. When you screw up, there is a period of time where you must accelerate back up to your old speed. During this time, slower drivers are catching up, and quicker drivers are widening the gap. That's the punishment of the mistake. With its burst of acceleration, Burst Nitrous targets this period specifically, and in doing so, reduces the consequence of error. Usually, small errors, especially things like not taking a corner in the ideal way. A bad drift entry can provide you with the Burst Nitrous you need to soften the consequence of the bad entry. And you want to know something cool? That's not the biggest way Burst Nitrous makes the game easier. A handy side effect to the burst is the way it essentially deletes unwanted momentum. If you're sliding too wide, it will remove the sideways motion, and that way a bad corner is saved. This is incredibly powerful, and so you might now think that Burst Nitrous is an easy and universal get-out-of-jail-free card, but it's not. This is still a game where every second matters. The good driver still wins, but its lowering of the bar is still immense. And what does that mean? Well, at times, it can mean falling asleep at the wheel. If you're in a good car and things aren't quick enough for traffic to be a concern, and the track isn't very demanding, and you're more than a week into the campaign so you're used to the driving physics by now, and you've got Burst Nitrous, which makes the only hard part of this affair easier, there is the old race in the later weeks that is just a bit boring. What's good about Burst Nitrous reducing the consequence of error is that in doing so, it also reduces the cost of bullshit, and in making recovery easier, Burst Nitrous, as much as the AI or anything else, may be responsible for my frequently vindicated belief that I could usually come back from a bad situation. There is an upside here, an important one, but Burst Nitrous could have had this win without its most egregious property. Deleting momentum? That's where it crosses the line. It excuses bad play far more often than it softens the blow of bullshit, further weakening the experience of slower tracks in the later game, and allowing you to deal with what ought to be the toughest corners thoughtlessly. All you have to do for sharp turns at high speed is handbrake to turn 90 degrees and Burst Nitrous to delete the forward momentum. It's easy, it always works, and along with the driver's spine, it shatters the fantasy for things to work this way. Sharp corners should be the biggest challenge, not for any reason rooted in game design, but because arcade or not, in Need for Speed, I want to feel like I'm driving a car-like thing, not a UFO. And on top of that, it feels wrong because it's cheap. The AI can't do it, but I can. I feel like I'm using hacks. And yet, in the end, what all these flaws amount to is nothing more than a dent in the strength of Unbound's core racing experience. So what about the campaign? Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's something that wants to stop you from getting there. The Rozzers. What's the role of a police system? Well, for one, they create a dynamic challenge to mechanically engage yourself with when you're not involved with the game's scripted content. For another, they can create consequences to particular player actions, and this was their primary role in Need for Speed Heat, where at night, the game operated on a risk-reward dynamic. The more races you won, the better the rewards, but the stronger the police. If you were caught, you lost everything. You could bank your money and end the night. But you could also take the risk, try to survive the cops a little longer, and do one more race. Heat's police succeeded, in the sense that they were tough, and so successfully fulfilled their role as Risk. Their failure was that they weren't especially fun to engage with in themselves. Enemy design was limited to a basic cop and a battering ram. Car combat wasn't viable, so your options were usually limited to driving very well and hoping for the best. In the end, most ended up abusing exploits. Enemy design was Heat's flaw, an Unbound success. You can no longer exploit them. Also, you can now beat them up, ram them, repeatedly smash them, push them into oncoming traffic. A few well-placed punts can put you into the cooldown state. It's a viable strategy, and in a pursuit, it means you've always got options. Another is rooted in the improvement to Unbound's cop AI. They make a far stronger attempt to predict where you're going, which makes it far easier to fake them out, to pretend you're going in one direction, then switch at the last moment. Tricking the cops is as effective in practice as destroying them, and by tapping into the fantasy of the skilled getaway driver, it's twice as cool. But what's especially interesting is the way different types of cop promote distinctly different responses. The Heat 3 Interceptor cannot be outrun, but their speed makes them easier to trick, and their street-focused build makes them weaker off-road. The Mud, however, is the territory of the Heat 2 SUV. Their weakness is a lower top speed, so the best way to lose them is to get on the tarmac and leave them in the dust. Unfortunately, this is as far as Unbound's interesting enemy design goes. Undercover at Heat 4 and the Raptor at Heat 5 are distinct only in that they take more punishment and have no weaknesses. And maybe that's okay for the top dog, but for a cop called Undercover, it is a shame Criterion do so little to honor the concept. Don't expect civilian cars to suddenly leap out at you mid-pursuit, as you'd expect from a cop who is trying to blend in. It's just a matte black Camaro, which ironically couldn't look more like a cop if they tried. But hey, it's a small disappointment. Even if it's only two of them, cop types that mean a damn add successfully to what is, in terms of design, the best police there has been in a racing game for years. When was the last time you played against police where intelligent driving was a viable strategy, where the cinematic play worked, and the best thing to do wasn't to hold the accelerator for 5 minutes or to stop driving entirely? So what a shame it is that the context they inhabit, their role in the game, holds them so far back. This will not have a simple explanation, so where I think we need to start is with the basics on Unbound's campaign. In Unbound, you can't choose between day and night. It's day, then night. Heat carries over from day to night, and unlike most racing games, every day and every night will make different events available. Most of them will be repeats, some will be recommended to you, and of those recommended, only some will be worth doing. You'll quickly understand which by subtracting the buy-in, which is the price you pay to enter the event, from the payout, which is how much you stand to win. At day, there's usually 1 or 2. At night, maybe 2 or 3. That's the gist of it. Now, the police. In Unbound, escaping the police is actually quite easy. For the first few hours, you may project your experiences with the Palm City PD and assume that Heat 5 has every chance of ending you. But then, you wise up. The cops are fast, but they're not very aggressive. Taking them out is easy at these speeds. Even trading paint will do the job, and with a few sudden route changes, you'll usually find yourself in the cooldown. It's not easy, but it's not hard, even at Heat 5, which means they don't create very much risk to the night's earnings, which doesn't initially sound like a very big deal, but it ends up leaving the game with its pants down. Firstly, because it pretty much obliterates the risk-reward decision process. There's no question of whether you should turn in for the night or keep going. You keep going because there's very little chance you'll lose your money, and so doing all the events worth doing becomes normal. It's not recklessness, it's baseline play, and as an immediate result, we lose the tension of risk. You still want to avoid the cops because you don't want to spend all that time escaping them if you're seen, but you know the stakes are nothing more than your time. The controller sweat tension from Heat doesn't happen here, nor the incredible relief of making it back to a safe house. Now, as easy as it may be to escape the police, it can be surprisingly hard to avoid them. You can crash into them before they have a chance to detect you, you can speed past them to the same effect, and you can double the time you have to do this with the Undercover Racer auxiliary upgrade. You're not playing Metal Gear Solid, but even so, it's their spawns that make the difference. It's that there are so fucking many of them, that despite all the ways you have to avoid them, they're still harder to avoid than Heat. They're everywhere. They've got helicopters. In fact, they spawn as if they were intended to punish a risk you deliberately took, not realizing that risk-reward is broken and dead, and what they are actually punishing is baseline play. Hitting Heat 5 isn't a gamble, it's just the game, and so the police come across not as a consequence, but as pests, trying to make your usual nightly routine take as long as possible. What's especially annoying about this is that the journeys between events were already the least enjoyable part of the game. They're often very long to begin with, and it's not as if you get to take in the sights, because if you want to have an idea of where you're going, you'll need to be glancing incessantly at the minimap. Unbound isn't like Forza Horizon, where the GPS route can be seen in-game, and you can reliably travel in a straight line. Lakeshore is filled with impassable obstacles, cliffs, rivers, walls. The GPS is not optional, so neither is your attention to the minimap. And what the cops do is make this 5 times worse. Cops spawn constantly, and in many situations you will need to react immediately, so you can't afford to not be fixated on that tiny portion of the screen. They make a dull journey duller, and a long journey longer. Further frustrations include being trapped behind a slow-moving police car on a road with no exits, being sandwiched between police cars that make detection all but certain, and being subjected to the absurdities of Lakeshore's destructible objects when you're veering off-road whilst avoiding the police. Ignoring the fact that the game's idea of destruction is having the object evaporate, the principal issue is that the distinction can be unclear between the things that will shatter on contact and things that will break you. Given that these fences are destructible, is it immediately obvious to you that this fence would not be, or this chain link fence covered in tarp here, when other chain link fences detonate? Given that most barriers are destructible, is it immediately obvious to you that this slightly taller barrier is not? It does this situation no favors that I could have been fooled into believing From Software designed the world with short concrete barriers cruelly hidden behind bushes and rocky cliffs that serve no purpose to the world design placed randomly throughout Lakeshore and which you cannot always clearly see. It's one of my least favorite things about Unbound, and it's the cherry on top of the very shitty pie that is moving between events. It's dull at best and infuriating at worst, and it's not the end of this conversation. Because the police are ineffective threats, you'll usually be comfortable doing all the events that you want to do. You'll probably go for 1 or 2 a day because you want to get to the superior night events with low heat. You want low heat because the less time you spend at high heat, the less time you spend dealing with the police, and the quicker you make your money. Once you've finished all the night events with the massive payouts and you've hit Heat 5, which usually happen at around the same time, there's no reason to continue. Unlike the previous game, higher heat levels don't multiply payouts, and only events with average payouts remain, and you'll now have to do them whilst avoiding the Heat 5 police. So why continue? Answer: you won't. You'll do all the events you want to do and stop at a similar time most nights. This becomes a routine, and that routine becomes boring. What the game would have liked the answer to be is its calendar system. If each reset pushes you closer to the weekend qualifier, then you should want to make more money per night in time for the qualifier so that your car will be strong enough, right? Unfortunately, this fails too. You'll get your car up to the top of its class ready to dominate the weekend in a day's time, 2 or 3 at most, with average income. The pressure of the limited week is completely ineffective, and in the end, Unbound's notions of risk and limited time amount to little more than window dressing for a campaign structure that bears the repetitive characteristics of a 9-to-5 job more than the thrill-seeking life of a young street racer, whilst at the same time sacrificing absolutely every other good thing about Need for Speed Heat's approach to day and night. We've lost the simple fact of them feeling different from each other, where day was sanctioned and characterized as such with branding, barriers, screens, and a post-race report, and night was illegal, with fans gathering on the tracks and races ending fluidly because you wouldn't want to stay in the same place for long. Day played calmly, like the average Need for Speed, while night operated on the risk-reward dynamic and thrilled with its tension, and we've lost the difference of what they rewarded. Day gave you money for purchases, and night gave you rep for unlocks. So depending on what you wanted or needed at the time, the experience of the campaign would change, adding to the game's variation and fighting against routine. Unbound's day and night, meanwhile, are identical in terms of fantasy and play. Their only important difference is that the rewards of day are worse, and so the only mechanical reason you play at day is because you're forced to. We've lost choice and change for nothing, and I'm not saying Unbound should have been the same as Heat, but it would have been nice if it wasn't so colossally worse. Still, the disadvantages of the design of Unbound's campaign continue. Because every day and night feature a different set of worthwhile events, much of the game's potential for variation depends on which events those are. Here's the thing, it's not random, it's Criterion's choice, so it does surprise me that the most obvious of mistakes are nonetheless made. Track variety, for instance, Tourist Trap and Inner City Circuit in B-Class, Power in A-Class, Smoke Show in S-Class, God Hour and Headspin in S+, feature 2 to 3 times in less than 1 week, whilst other tracks have yet to be introduced or have not been seen in a great deal of time. Similar tracks are likewise bunched up together, with most of week 1 set slap bang in the mid-city, and a similar failure of distribution affects event type. Drift events and takeovers succeed as variation, but fail as equal partners to genuine races, for the obvious reason that they feature a fraction of the depth and a fraction of the thrill. So why have 3 so closely together in week 1? And I was equally disappointed with the placement of high heat deliveries. These involve escaping, then avoiding the police on your way to a particular location. You'll only ever get them at night, which is probably not the best idea because at night, half of what you're already doing is escaping and avoiding the police on your way to a particular location. And so high heat deliveries feel like they're dragging things out more than mixing things up. They would have been far better placed at day. Throughout Unbound's 4-week campaign, and especially in in the early game, I was regularly baffled at how needlessly and how often the game weakened itself by following the opposite of simple distribution logic. It's not as if there are a lot of event types in total to help this situation either. Drift events are takeovers but with no targets to smash, head-to-head and half-pack are just races but with fewer rivals, endurance races are races but long. It's only speed races that noticeably impact playstyle. Their focus on long highways favor a top speed build, and demand quick reflexes as traffic appears faster and faster. But that's the show. There is no off-road event, no event that tests grip over drift, no drag race. The police are usually irrelevant in any event they join. The elimination mode is exclusive to the qualifiers, and there is nothing more inventive than these simplistic suggestions. Unbound just about gets away with its repetitive campaign, its dull open world, and its shattered risk-reward dynamic thanks to the steadfast success of its core gameplay. The driving and racing are fun. They hold back the tides of absurd and needless mediocrity, and in the end, Unbound is still a good time, but it is deflating to see so clearly how much better the game could have been. Let's now turn our eyes away from the mechanics and at last away from the minimap to the actual world in which they're set. Take me down to the lakeshore city where the trees are green and the graphics are pretty. And they really are pretty. The step up from heat is staggering. It is hard to see the cracks in the rain or the reflections or the car models or the lighting at any of Lakeshore's numerous times of day. Unbound's new makeup is a resounding success. And yet, not the best thing about the way it looks. It's the detail of Lakeshore that truly makes the difference. It's that this city makes none of the small concessions that we've come to expect from the racing genre. Nothing seems unfinished or unnaturally empty. Everything is filled with everything you'd expect to be there. From bins to lights, from flags to signs. There is graffiti. There is a freight train and the L train. There are birds in the sky. The shop faces are numerous and believable. And most of all, there are pedestrians, hundreds of them. You'll even see workers at work sites, and the difference this makes is staggering, perhaps most clearly demonstrated by a return to Need for Speed Heat, where the deadness of a hot beach city not having people in it is immediately noticeable. Lakeshore is vivid, and a new standard for the realization of urban environments in racing games. It is a bit boring though, isn't it? Yes, of course, there had to be a caveat, and for Unbound, it's that Lakeshore is, well, a pretty unremarkable American city, lacking in both charm and character. Its forests are green, its city is grey, it's a lot of concrete and glass. And unlike gaming's last big-budget rendition of Chicago, none of that fits into a larger atmosphere. Watch Dogs was about the shadows, the silent evil behind the glass. The disturbed Aiden Pierce seemed sprung from its gutters and was at home in the rain. But Lakeshore feels at a disconnect. It's kinda just there. It's just the setting that was chosen, and its characteristics are only associated with the rest of the game in the vaguest possible terms. So instead of creating a vibe, Lakeshore simply reads as yet another unremarkable American city in an open-world video game. It's not moody, it's just raining. And the same type of disconnect applies to almost all of Unbound's artistic ideas. Now, Heat couldn't decide whether it was about social media-obsessed Zoomers or 80s synthwave, so let's not put it on a pedestal. But it's clear enough that neon checkpoints and UI stylizations contributed to at least one of its art styles. Unbound's choice of colors, meanwhile, are washed-out green and washed-out orange. The UI and loading screens are mostly grey, and the visual effects, though pretty, feel no more fitting. Unbound would like you to believe it's street art, it's graffiti, but it just isn't. There are fleeting resemblances in moments, but most of the time they could be taken from any comic, sketchbook, or cel-shaded video game on the planet. It doesn't look street, or Chicago, or rebellious, or associated with cars. It just looks drawn. It doesn't clash with anything, it just doesn't connect with anything, and anything could have made it work. It could emerge from character, for instance. What if the protagonist was an artist who designs wraps for Idle's rides? As it is, like Lakeshore, the visual effects are just there. Pretty but disparate. And I think this kind of disconnect even applies to the game's tone. Unbound seems to believe that the street scene is a place of risk and high tempers where winning is all that matters. It's a revenge plot, about getting your car back from a traitorous friend. It's also a story almost entirely composed of light-hearted jokes and chipper characters having chipper convos with a kind, likable protagonist who seemingly cares deeply for everyone in her life, even her rivals. What's the tone? Revenge? But no one's angry. Tense, but everyone's cool. When you run a vibe check on this game, there's no result. Unbound doesn't feel like anything. It's flat, and so difficult to love more than like. The biggest disconnect of them all, however, has nothing to do with art. It's the disconnect of the game's most fundamental narrative premises with what you actually experience, and how that affects immersion and fantasy. According to the story, Lakeshore is defined by its street scene. It has a history, a long one. There are factions within it, and the mayor has become personally obsessed with taking you down. And you know what? I never believed it once. Despite the mayor's legion of cops hunting a supposed street racing scourge in Lakeshore, you will never see a single street racer in Lakeshore, or a pursuit that you're not in, or a race that you're not in. Every meetup cutscene is shot in the same car park, and the fans no longer have a presence before or during races, all of which contributes to an impression of the street scene being small and insular. But nothing does that quite so severely as the rivals themselves. Their fleshed out realization makes the cracks more apparent, and what's apparent is that there's like 10 of them in the entire street scene. The roster hardly shifts over the 2-year gap from the prologue to week 1, and half the time it does, they're rotating the absent prologue racers back into the roster. Is this a street scene? Because it feels more like a secret book club. It's a small little thing, but the way races ended fluidly in Heat, with your rivals going their separate ways and the cops continuing their chases, did so much for the impression of truth to what street racing was in Palm City. Unbound separates the instances, which despawns rivals, and fails to maintain the continuity of where the cops were in the race, which makes it feel like racing and Lakeshore are separate. And that is the problem in a nutshell. There's no impression that the cultural, political, or social significance of street racing in Lakeshore is actually real, and that deals a noticeable blow to my immersion in the world, the fantasy of street racing within it, and my investment in 2 critical narrative goals: to stick it to the mayor, and to win the biggest street race in Lakeshore. Unbound's story will have to survive on the strength of its script alone, and that's worrying because stories and racing games tend to need all the help they can get. Is this one among them? Well, you wouldn't think so from the prologue. Things get off to a surprisingly strong start, with the protagonist and her best friend Jasmine excitedly joining the Lakeshore street scene in a car they spent all summer building. 2 orphans who never had much are now finally making a mark on the world. This means everything to them. Although he first urges caution, Rydell, their boss and father figure, was once a racer himself. It doesn't take long for the girls to get his blessing. You race, you win, you're finally alive, finally moving upwards. But as you do, the things weighing Yaz down feel ever more oppressive. You understand why, for this character at this time in her life, Rydell saying something as innocent as "fix the client's cars properly" would piss her off as much as it does. You understand the difficulty she has truly believing in any family figure, having been passed around like an unwanted burden her entire childhood. She resents all her shackles, and she'll take any path forward. Alec, an old friend from the foster system, comes to Yaz with a delivery job. It doesn't seem right. It's a big risk and we don't know this guy, but she wants to take it. And with a well-executed build-up of tension, one unexplained absence after another, it becomes clear that something is wrong, and after worriedly returning to Rydell that the true target was him. Yaz didn't know they'd do this, but she should have known. Rydell told her not to fall in with these people, and when he loses it, reminding her that no one else would have taken her in, she makes a choice in the heat of the moment to commit to the betrayal, and then there's no turning back. Criterion have got the beginning they were going for, a betrayal that was never meant to be. For the duration of this prologue, I was taken aback. The characters have character and react believably to things. There's a plot, where things are set up and paid off. The protagonist is neither annoying nor silent. The performances are all strong. Sometimes there's jokes, and they're not always bad, though at times inorganic. The dialogue is usually not. You're usually convinced Rydell and Yaz could be real people. This is big for a racing game. And now I'll tell you what's bad, because there had to be something. Because this wasn't great, but it was far too good to be true. Criterion portray a betrayal that was never meant to be, to set up the ending of reconciliation. Spoiler alert, Yaz comes back, and Rydell finds the strength to forgive her. It turns out, you guys, that belonging to a family was the life she truly needed. Aww. It's not the typical Need for Speed revenge story. The problem is, until the ending, it's still a revenge story. There is very little going on besides it, and no one, the protagonist nor the player, is particularly interested in getting revenge. The story has gone to great lengths to portray Jasmine as a redeemable character. She did make a mistake. She's not innocent, but she's a misguided 19-year-old girl who didn't intend for what happened to happen. And the protagonist and Rydell pretty much know that too. They'd like to beat her, but they certainly don't want to hurt her, often saying things like, "I wish it hadn't come to this, it's all so unnecessary." That's the beating heart of Unbound's story. If the characters don't even want to win that badly, what's motivating me? Oh yes, she also nicked my wanky riced-up Lambo Countach. It was smart for the prologue car to be an A+, and for week 1 to start you in a B. That way you feel what Yaz took from you. But a week later, you're in a new A+. A week after that, you've got multiple. As revenge gets ever closer, the prospect of getting your car back becomes ever less attractive. I have Porsches and McLarens before the grand, and cars I have formed a greater bond to than I ever did to that crummy old Lambo. The writers could not have avoided this problem, I acknowledge. My point is simply that the car does absolutely nothing to motivate the story. A far less forgivable failure is that of Alec, the unseen benefactor of the grand, the one who actually plotted to rob Rydell. by all means, he is the true villain of Need for Speed Unbound. So that Criterion doesn't even put a face to the name is baffling. For the most part, he is mentioned in passing, and your revenge on him is limited to simply being told that he's gone broke at the end. Emphasizing revenge on Alec could have gone a long way to alleviating Unbound's lacking will. The indifference towards beating Yaz, winning the Grand, or getting our car back leaves you thirsty for any story content whatsoever to engage or interest, or to simply fill the void, something Unbound just doesn't have. So let's address what little we've got. With cutscenes few and far between, the story throughout the campaign will be delivered through dialogue. There'll be conversations in the garage, phone calls in the car, and broadcasts over the radio. Some of these conversations have decent writing behind them. For every 10 jokes, about 1 is actually funny. A staggering success compared to Heat and Horizon. We're also given some valuable insight into why Rydell wants Yaz's car back. In an early chat between him and Tess, he opens up about his late father, that it was his car until Yaz and the protagonist took an interest in what they thought was a heap of junk. This mattered because it's a touch of real motive. Sadly, what's said in the garage is what's least likely to be heard. You'll oftentimes have no upgrades to make and head out before anyone has a chance to speak. It's easy to miss the few things that matter, but driving through Lakeshore, it's hard to miss the many things that don't. Tess's 28th dumbass quip. Rydell expressing that he's proud of you, kid. I'm glad there's something to fill the silence. But the repetition of meaningless car chatter in a story lacking for substance is baffling. Unbound spins its wheels relentlessly, and it's not long before you've given up on the hope that it'll ever find traction. Even the radio shows regarding Lakeshore's politics are practically reiterations of the same paragraph. Mayor Stevenson has a financial conflict of interest with her sponsors, and struggles to justify her obsessive persecution of street racers. Her electoral opponent, Holden Parker, is old and out of touch, whilst the Lake Lab podcast is progressive and makes vaguely progressive suggestions in a progressive vocal tone. Rinse, repeat, forever. There's a semblance of escalation in week 4 when Stevenson fires her campaign staff and we learn that the host of Lake Lab is Stevenson's daughter, but this goes no further, and it is far too little, far too late. You know, they don't even tell you why street racers are being so harshly persecuted. Is it a personal vendetta for Stevenson? Is it corruption? Corruption from who? And why? So what's left? Well, don't be so glum, for we have the privilege of being graced with the presence of world-famous Minecraft speedrunner A$AP Rocky. He personally introduces the takeover events, with a grand total of 3 potential lines. 3. There are more than 3 takeover events, you guys. It starts to feel like Criterion couldn't afford him by the end of week 1, which starts to make it feel like the cross-promotion it is, instead of an organic part of the game. You'll get a unique SOS call from Rocky in week 3. The protagonist relentlessly fangirls over being in the same car as him, and he shifts the conversation awkwardly to his inspirations and worldview. At no point does any of this sound scripted or inauthentic, but that's probably because it is literally a studio interview that Criterion attempt to edit into something that sounds like a natural conversation.
But for me, it's more so just making it, just showing people that we're all relatable in the same sense that
they fail horribly. It sounds like you're listening to a podcast, but that doesn't mean it's not interesting. It is, for 2 minutes, and you'll never speak again. So, that leaves us with she who must not be named. Tess, your manager, who you hire on day 1 to, manage. Not to call you twice a day with her inane, quirky banter, but hey. Like every other form of dialogue in this game, most of what Tess says is the same. Hey Speedy, I'm being super weird to deflect your suspicions that I may not have your best interests at heart. Haha, so random, XD, bye! As you might imagine, this gets tiring quickly. 1, because it's repetitive, and 2, because it's completely botched. All of this is leading up to an eventual blowout between you and Tess at the end of week 3. She wants to fix the final race. You don't. The reason this falls so completely flat is the build-up. Tess has been the sussiest of buckers from day fucking 1. During an early delivery contract, she explains the police who gave chase were simply the stunt team for a movie, an excuse so obviously weak that we and the protagonist take it as a confession of her dishonesty. She is lying, and putting us in danger for her personal gain. So isn't it weird the protagonist seems to have forgiven her come the next delivery? Isn't it weird that as time goes on, we jump from 50% suspicious of Tess, to 100%, to 10%, to treating Tess's lies as one of her quirky personality traits, to falling out in week 3 over fixing a race. So 15 instances of life-threatening risk was fine, but cheating in a race is too far. All this would make the protagonist seem completely insane, and Tess seem like the luckiest scumbag who ever lived, but it doesn't, because you stop taking it seriously a third of the way through. Your reconciliation with Jasmine during week 4 happens too quickly. Even for a character as kind-hearted as the protagonist, being back to buddy talk in 2 conversations time is too fast to feel human. In every way but this, it works. Unbound keeps up its high standard of voice acting and natural conversation. You feel the awkwardness, the uncomfortable silence, the latent tension, and the humor forced in by both characters to help relieve that tension. You get the sense Yaz wants this, badly, but struggles to be vulnerable. She's still caught between her resentment of family and her need for it, and it takes strength for her to finally say the word sorry. But she does, and it lands.
Look who I found.
Sounds pretty. Smells nice, too. Rydell,
Compressor shot. Dude tried to fix it himself. I told him. Now I gotta undo what he did.
Should've listened to you.
Pain in the ass. So how's the heights?
Overrated. You take the turbo out first?
Since when do you do things by the book?
Well, never too late to start.
Well, all right.
Subtext and organic character writing isn't something you expect from a racing game. No, it's not masterful, but it allows Unbound's paper-thin story to end on a genuine, heartfelt note, which, in a way that is both remarkable and entirely unsurprising, makes this the best writing in a racing game since Driver San Francisco. If only Criterion had the money or time to put something between its beginning and end, because nothing's gonna change the fact that they wrote a false revenge story and expected it to uphold the game as if it were true. It feels like there is something missing from Need for Speed Unbound, a subtle feeling of emptiness that followed me from day one to the grand itself. And I don't just mean the story. It's the inorganic repetition of the campaign that made me feel like I was optimizing the street scene instead of living in it. It's the fact that I was not always convinced that the street scene even existed, and that though Lakeshore City was alive, I could not find its heart. But the racing is good. It's better than it's been for years. So play it, and then wait for 3 more years in the painfully familiar hope that Need for Speed will truly find itself again. Special thanks go out to Elle Hudson, Lex Williams, Dominic Jaworski, Andre Baltuta, Holy Shift, Dennis Williams, Combat Wombat, John Lemley, Shade, Joshua W. Schreiner, Bosian, Dylan Schaefer-Murphy, Warthol, The Last Great Opium Den. I joined Tier 3 because I wanted to hear Whitelight say this out loud. Dan Walker, Newts, Rakin Hock, Nathan, Attila, Brendan Harris, Caleb Finnemore, DJ, Chino, Chase Baker, Eli Weaver, G. Series, William Vossler, Joe Simmons, I Pay My Cam Girl So Why Not You, Navy Husky, Save, MT the Poet, Voy, Deluxo, Kelvin Black, Dr. Pavel, The Wayfinder 12, Malone Patron, John C., Corey Walterbeek, Hidibari, Anton, Floyd Dibben, Storyteller Max, Monochrome Only, Roller Runner, Brybase, Milo W, Jason H, Shahzabe, Arshad Mirza, Purple PP, Pitstab, Joshua Lovejoy, Vincent DeLuca, Veda, Jake, Uncle High Poggers, and Ryan in a Basket.